It was supposed to be a quick trip, just another house to check off the list. Ben and I had been house hunting for months, and we were getting frustrated. Every place we looked at was either too expensive or too far out of our price range. But then we saw it, a rundown house on the outskirts of town, the kind you'd pass by without a second thought. The listing was cheap, almost suspiciously so. Too good to be true, right? But something about it intrigued us. We figured, what the hell, let's take a look. The moment we pulled up to the house, I knew it needed more work than we had initially anticipated. The roof had holes in it, the windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. But the price, seriously, it was ridiculous. This place had potential if we could fix it up, and I liked the idea of being somewhere away from the noise of the city. Ben and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked beneath our feet. The living room was bare, except for an old couch that looked like it had been there for decades. We moved slowly through the house, taking it all in. It felt cold and abandoned, but not completely empty. That's when we started noticing the signs. In the kitchen, there was a half-eaten sandwich on the counter. It looked fresh, not like something that had been sitting there for weeks. I froze for a moment, wondering if someone had forgotten it. Ben didn't seem to notice and kept moving toward the stairs. But I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. We decided to check upstairs. The staircase was steep, and each step seemed to groan under our weight. At the top, we found what looked like a small bedroom. There, in the corner of the room, was a mattress on the floor, covered in rumpled sheets. A book sat open on the nightstand, its pages yellowed with age. The strangest part, there was a strange odor in the air, something faint but unmistakable, like sweat and something else I couldn't place. "Sarah, look at this," Ben called from the hallway. I walked toward him, my heart pounding. He was holding a small box of what appeared to be canned food, all neatly stacked on the floor. The expiration dates were recent. "Someone's been here," Ben said, his voice low. I nodded, a pit forming in my stomach. This place was supposed to be abandoned, but it clearly wasn't. We turned back toward the stairs, but that's when we heard it. A noise from upstairs, something heavy dragging across the floor. We froze, both of us listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I whispered, "Ben, we need to leave. Now." But before I could grab his arm, the noise stopped. And then from behind us came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed Ben's hand, pulling him toward the staircase. But as we reached the bottom, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. I whirled around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me. "We're not alone." Ben's eyes were wide with fear. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The floor above us creaked again, heavier now, as if someone was walking directly over us. I could hear the faint sound of breathing. Suddenly, a voice came from above, low and rough, like it had been unused for days. "Did you think you could just walk in here and take what's mine?" I nearly collapsed in shock. We hadn't been alone for even a second. A man, tall, dirty, and unshaven, emerged from the shadows at the top of the stairs. His eyes were wild, and his hands were clenched into fists. I took a step back, pulling Ben with me, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped in the hallway, no escape. "You're going to regret this," the man growled. "I won't let anyone take what's mine." Ben shoved me aside and tried to rush past him, but the man's arm shot out, grabbing him by the collar. I screamed, but he didn't seem to care. I was frozen, my heart racing as I watched the man drag Ben away toward the back of the house. I had to think. I had to do something. Without thinking, I rushed to the side door at the end of the hallway. It was the only other exit. I pushed with all my strength and felt the lock give way. The door swung open just enough for me to squeeze through. I ran outside, gasping for air, not stopping to look back until I reached the street. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I heard the man's voice faintly in the distance, but I didn't dare turn around. As I reached the end of the street, I pulled out my phone, dialing 911. The operator answered, and I gave them the address, telling them everything I knew. When they asked for the details of the situation, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I hadn't actually seen the man's face. I was too focused on Ben's safety, on the immediate threat. But now that I thought about it, I remembered something strange. The house was still listed as abandoned in the real estate ads. The cops arrived within minutes, and we went back to the house together. But when they searched the entire property, there was no trace of the man. No sign of struggle, no mattress, no canned food. The place was as empty as it had been when we first arrived. They found nothing. But when the realtor called me later that day, he asked, "How did you know about the squatter?" I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The house had been listed for months. We'd been trying to sell it. No one had been living there. I couldn't explain it, and I never would. But I knew one thing for sure. The squatter had been watching us long before we ever set foot inside that house. And now, he was gone. Just like the house, and like everything else that had happened there. Maybe we were never meant to be there at all. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of everything. The police were still inside the house, searching every room, but it felt as if I were trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. No one had seen the man, not even the officers who carefully scoured the place. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. I felt dizzy, my hands shaking as I leaned against the car. Ben was sitting in the passenger seat, his face pale and tense. He hadn't spoken a word since we left the house. I hadn't known what to say either. How could I explain the terror I felt when I realized we weren't just looking at a rundown house? How could I make sense of the fact that someone dangerous, had been living there without anyone noticing? The police assured us that we could leave for the night and they would continue their investigation, but they were clearly just as baffled as we were. There were no signs of forced entry, no strange fingerprints, no evidence that anyone had been squatting there at all. Everything seemed perfectly normal, as if we had just imagined it. But I knew better. I wasn't crazy. Something had happened. We drove in silence for a while, my mind replaying every moment, every detail of what we'd seen in that house. When I mentioned the man's voice, Ben still didn't respond. I looked over at him, my throat tight. "Ben, talk to me, please." His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and then he sighed, his gaze falling to his lap. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm just confused. I don't know what's real anymore." "I know," I said quietly, "but I'm not making this up. We weren't alone in that house." Ben looked at me, his expression softening. "I believe you. But why didn't he do anything? Why didn't he hurt us?" I thought about it, about how the man had only watched us, how he hadn't come any closer even when we were trapped. He had seemed just as unsure of us as we were of him. And then it hit me. He wasn't expecting us to be there. He wasn't the one who had lured us in. "I think someone else was watching us," I said slowly, my voice shaky. "I think he was protecting the house. But he wasn't trying to hurt us. He was trying to warn us." Ben blinked, processing my words. "What do you mean?" "I think he was watching us for a reason," I explained. "Maybe he wasn't as dangerous as we thought. Maybe he was just desperate to keep people out. Maybe he was trying to keep the house a secret." Ben seemed to consider this, then nodded. "That makes sense. It's not like he attacked us. He didn't even try to stop us from leaving." "But that doesn't explain the fresh food, the mattress, everything that looked like it had been used recently," I said, my voice trembling. It didn't feel right then. It was all too calculated. We both fell silent, thinking about the house, the man, and the strange feeling of being watched. Eventually, we pulled into the driveway of our apartment. It was late, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the streetlights outside. We both sat there for a moment, staring at the building, unsure of what to do next. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't right. I made a decision. I called the realtor back and explained everything that had happened, the strange signs of life in the house, the man, the unsettling atmosphere. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he sounded almost relieved. "I'm glad you called," he said. "I've been trying to reach you. There's something you should know." I listened carefully as he explained. The house we had visited hadn't been abandoned at all. In fact, it had been vacant for years due to a series of legal battles over the property. The owner, a man named Richard Matthews, had been in and out of legal trouble for years, and the house had been marked for demolition. But no one had been able to get inside until recently, until the new real estate listing was posted, hoping to find a buyer. The twist? Richard Matthews had been living in the house for months, squatting there to avoid arrest. He had been slipping past the authorities, hiding in the shadows of the property, but no one knew where he was. No one except the people who tried to buy it, and maybe, just maybe, the man I had seen. Richard Matthews had been living there quietly, scared, and avoiding the law. You were the first ones to come close to figuring it out, the realtor continued. No one had dared go inside until you did. That's when I understood. The man in the house wasn't a threat to us. He was just a man, desperate to stay hidden, to keep his presence secret. The squatter, the one who had been living in the shadows, he had just been waiting for someone like us to come along, someone to stir things up, and when we left, he disappeared. The police closed the case, but I couldn't forget the strange feeling that had settled over me in that house. As much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't. That house and the man who had been hiding there would always be with me, and in some strange way, I felt sorry for him. Richard Matthews had been hiding in plain sight all along, and we had been the ones to uncover his secret. But the truth was, no one was ever really safe in a place like that, not even him. We had been on the road for hours, the sun setting behind us as we cruised down an empty stretch of highway. It was supposed to be a relaxing road trip, just me, Mike, Jen, and Chris, 4 friends escaping the grind of daily life. But somewhere along the way, the endless fields and barren landscape started to feel unsettling. We needed a break, and that's when we saw it. An old, dilapidated house stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Peeling paint, broken windows, and a sagging roof. Of course, we all immediately decided it was the perfect spot for an impromptu adventure. What could go wrong? We parked the car and approached the house, laughing at how eerie it looked in the fading light. The door creaked open easily, as if it hadn't been locked in years. The inside smelled musty, like decay. There was dust everywhere, old furniture rotting in the corners, and strange, cluttered rooms filled with piles of things no one had touched in decades. But it wasn't just the abandoned look that caught my attention, it was the personal belongings. There were old clothes hanging from the closet, a half-finished meal sitting on a table, and photos framed on the walls. Whoever lived here had only recently left. I pointed this out to the group, but they laughed it off, figuring it was some old relic of the past. I was about to suggest we leave when Jen screamed. We all rushed to her side, finding her standing by a door at the back of the house. The door was cracked open, revealing a narrow, dark hallway leading to another room, almost like a hidden space. "I don't like this," Mike muttered, but curiosity got the better of us, and we pushed ahead. As we crept down the hallway, the air grew colder, and the silence was unnerving. We found more rooms, each one stranger than the last. A tiny, windowless bedroom with a single mattress on the floor, a locked room filled with old journals and disturbing, handwritten notes, all in a cryptic scrawl. My heart began to race. "I think we should go," I said, my voice shaking. "This place feels wrong." But Mike and Chris were already flipping through the journals, reading some of the notes aloud. "It's like someone's been watching people," Chris said, his voice low and unnerved. "These look like observations, like someone was tracking us." That's when we heard it, a faint sound of movement from somewhere deep in the house. The floorboards creaked, the kind of noise that makes your spine tingle. We froze. The door to the room we had come from slammed shut. Panic set in. We rushed back to the front door, only to find it was now locked. "Someone's here," Jen gasped, her voice cracking with fear. We tried every window, but they were sealed tight. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some abandoned house. We weren't trespassing in an empty building. Someone had been living here, and they were watching us. "Help!" Chris yelled, banging on the windows, but no one answered. We retreated back to the hallway, desperately trying to figure out how to escape. Then, through the thin walls, I heard something, a soft, muffled voice, barely audible. It sounded like a whisper, but there was something almost mechanical about it. My pulse quickened. "He's been tracking us," I muttered, the horror sinking in. "We've triggered his traps." That's when I saw it. A small door, barely noticeable, hidden behind an old cabinet. A narrow staircase led down into what could only be described as a basement. A faint light flickered from below. "Go," I urged, pushing the others toward the stairs. "We need to get out of here." We scrambled down, trying to stay quiet, but the sounds of footsteps above us were getting closer. When we reached the bottom, I turned to look behind me, and that's when I saw it. The basement was a tiny, cluttered room, full of old tools, boxes, and discarded items. But on the far wall, there was something I hadn't noticed until now. A series of screens, mounted on the wall, showing different angles of the house. In each frame I could see us, standing in different rooms, our every move being watched. But there was something else on the screens. A figure, hidden in the shadows, watching us. It wasn't the man I expected to see. It was me, a reflection of myself, just standing there, staring blankly at the screen. That's when I understood. This entire time, I hadn't been running from a stranger. I was being hunted by someone who had been following my every step, not just through the house, but through my entire life. It wasn't just this place. The traps, the surveillance, it was all part of something bigger, something I was already too deep into to escape. I turned to the others. "We're not leaving, not like this." The twist, the real trap wasn't just the house, it was us, trapped by our own curiosity, by the decision to wander into something we couldn't comprehend, something that had been waiting for us far longer than we'd ever realized. I stared at the screen in front of me, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure, me, was still frozen, staring at the monitors. It didn't make sense. How could I be here in this room, watching myself on the screen? The realization hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just the house that had been rigged. It was me. It was as if someone had been tracking my every movement, through my phone, my social media, every place I'd been. My curiosity had drawn me into this mess. I turned to look at the others. Mike, Jen, and Chris stood frozen by the stairs, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. They had no idea what was going on, and frankly, I didn't either. All I knew was that something was seriously wrong, and if we didn't get out soon, we were never leaving this place. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jen swallowed hard. "How? We can't just leave. He's been watching us, and he's probably going to lock us in here like the others." I looked around the basement, trying to think. There had to be a way out. That's when I noticed the door at the far end of the room. It was a small, unassuming door, but it wasn't locked. It had to be our way out. "Come on," I urged, walking quickly toward the door. "We've got to move before he comes down here." We shuffled quietly toward the door, but just as I reached for the handle, I heard it. Footsteps above us, slow and deliberate. Someone was coming. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly. I froze, holding my breath, waiting to see if the noise would alert whoever was upstairs. The footsteps stopped. I exhaled slowly, and we crept through the door into a narrow hallway. There were no more screens, no more surveillance equipment, just walls lined with peeling wallpaper, a dark, cold passage leading to what looked like an exit. It was a way out of this nightmare. We moved quietly but swiftly, navigating the tight corridor. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure on the screen, about how everything we'd done in this house seemed to have been planned for us, as if we were part of some sick game. But there was one thing I realized as we moved further down the hallway. We weren't the first to stumble into this trap. The walls were covered in scratch marks, old bloodstains, and faded messages. Someone had been here before us, and they hadn't made it out. I could feel the fear creeping in again, but I pushed it down. We were close. We had to be. After what felt like hours, we reached a door. I tried the handle, locked. Frustration built inside me, but I wasn't giving up. I slammed my shoulder against the door, once, twice, until the old wood gave way. The door swung open, revealing a small, isolated room with a single window at the far side. We rushed inside, but the window was barred. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. A ladder tucked in the corner, leading to a hatch above. It was narrow, but it was our only chance. "Go, go," I whispered, urging the others to climb up first. They didn't need much convincing. Jen scrambled up the ladder, followed by Mike, and Chris went last. I was the last to climb, and just as I reached the top, I heard something behind us. A creak, a shuffle of movement. The hatch opened with a loud snap, and I pulled myself out into the fresh air. We were outside. Finally, we stumbled away from the house, not looking back. The old building loomed behind us, silent again, as if it had never been anything more than a nightmare. Once we reached the safety of the car, we all collapsed inside, breathing heavily. I couldn't stop shaking. What had just happened? How had we gotten involved in something so twisted? But at least we were free. As we drove off, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. It wasn't over. Whatever that man had planned for us, whatever his twisted game was, we had escaped, but we couldn't escape everything. I looked at my phone, the screen still glowing faintly in the dark car. My thumb hovered over the power button, and I finally turned it off. No more searching, no more temptation. I wanted to believe that the nightmare was over. But a small voice in the back of my head whispered that it wasn't. We hadn't been the first to wander into that house, and we wouldn't be the last. Someone else would find it. Someone else would fall into the trap. And maybe next time, it wouldn't be as lucky. But for now, we were free, and that had to be enough.